The ancient mechanism that Thomas Caldwell uncovered within his family's 150-year-old stone silo wouldn't just transform his understanding of his struggling Montana homestead. It would reveal a Civil War-era breakthrough so extraordinary that it would force engineers to rewrite the history of American innovation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Caldwell Ranch had always stood as a testament to resilience against the corporate agricultural empires that gradually consumed neighboring properties across the valleys. The imposing cylindrical silo, constructed by Thomas's great-great-grandfather Jeremiah in 1873, had become a landmark in White Pine County, its distinctive red sandstone exterior weathered by a century and a half of Montana seasons. As modern harvesting equipment roared through neighboring fields of wheat and barley, the silo stood as a silent sentinel to a bygone era of American farming. At 52, Thomas had witnessed the relentless transformation of the agricultural landscape with a mixture of stubborn determination and quiet desperation. As neighboring family operations fell one by one to corporate acquisition, the old silo had remained unused for almost 40 years, its massive frame casting long shadows across the dwindling Caldwell acreage each sunset. The ranch, once spanning 1,200 acres of Montana's most fertile soil, had been reduced to barely 400 through generations of difficult decisions and mounting operational costs. Local stories whispered about Jeremiah Caldwell's unusual fixation with the silo's construction, how he'd traveled as far as Boston and Philadelphia to source specific materials, insisted on unusual modifications to standard designs of the era, and personally supervised every aspect of its assembly. The original blueprints had vanished decades ago, and the handful of surviving daguerreotypes showed teams of laborers working under Jeremiah's intense scrutiny, their expressions lost to time and the limitations of early photography. What distinguished the silo from others built during the same period wasn't merely its impressive stature or the quality of its stonework. It was the perplexing complexity of its interior architecture. The few ranch hands who had assisted with its maintenance in earlier generations often remarked on its peculiar internal layout, featuring sealed compartments, curious access hatches, and elaborate ventilation systems that appeared to serve no clear agricultural purpose. Thomas's father, Franklin, had always dismissed these peculiarities as his grandfather's architectural eccentricities, but emerging circumstances would soon cast these anomalies in an entirely different light. The valley surrounding the Caldwell Ranch had changed dramatically over the decades. Land that once supported dozens of family farms now belonged primarily to Heartland Agricultural Industries, a corporate behemoth whose massive wheat operations stretched across 3 counties. Their modern facilities, gleaming metal silos equipped with computerized monitoring systems, temperature controls, and automated grain processing, made the Caldwell silo look like a relic from another world entirely. Thomas's wife, Eleanor, who taught history at the local high school, had always appreciated the silo's historical significance. "There's something special about that structure," she would say, running her fingers along the weathered sandstone. Jeremiah wasn't just building a grain storage facility, he was creating something meant to last centuries. Their children had grown up in the shadow of the imposing structure. Jessica, now 26 and pursuing her doctorate in agricultural Engineering at Montana State University had often incorporated the silo into her childhood games, imagining it as everything from a princess tower to a space station. Michael, 23 and recently returned to the ranch after completing his business degree, had always viewed the structure with practical skepticism, questioning the wisdom of maintaining a building that served no modern purpose on their struggling operation. "It's taking up valuable space, Dad," Michael had argued just last month. "We could dismantle it and expand the equipment shed. That stone would fetch a good price with architectural salvage companies." Thomas couldn't explain his reluctance to part with the structure, even as the ranch's financial situation grew increasingly precarious. Something deeper than sentiment kept him from considering its removal, an inexplicable certainty that the silo held more value than anyone realized. The decision to finally inspect the silo's sealed lower chambers came during the harsh winter of 2025, when unprecedented storms swept across the northern Rockies, bringing record-breaking cold and structural concerns across the property. Thomas had begun noticing unusual phenomena around the silo's base during particularly frigid nights. Subtle vibrations that traveled through the ground, faint humming sounds that couldn't be attributed to wind or settling stone, and most puzzlingly, small patches of ground near the foundation that remained mysteriously free of snow and ice despite below-zero temperatures. Using thermal imaging equipment borrowed from Jessica's university research department, Thomas detected anomalous heat patterns deep within the silo's foundation. Consistent temperature readings that defied explanation in a structure that had supposedly stood dormant for 4 decades through Montana's brutal temperature extremes. "This makes absolutely no sense," Jessica said, studying the thermal data on her tablet. "We're registering steady heat signatures at least 20 feet below ground level. These readings suggest some kind of active energy source, but that's impossible in a structure built in the 1870s with no power connection." The mysterious thermal patterns coincided with Thomas's discovery of a leather-bound journal hidden behind a loose panel in his father's old oak desk. The book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, contained meticulously detailed notes and technical drawings in Jeremiah Caldwell's distinctive script. The entries dated primarily from 1868 through 1875, the period immediately following the Civil War, when Jeremiah had established the ranch after returning from service with the Union Army. Most intriguing were recurring references to something Jeremiah called the perpetual engine, and cryptic mentions of securing agricultural independence through mechanical autonomy. Several pages appeared to have been carefully removed, leaving tantalizing fragments of what seemed to be complex mechanical specifications and correspondence with unnamed associates in eastern cities. The local historical society had long celebrated the silo as an excellent example of post-Civil War agricultural architecture, but the thermal anomalies and mysterious journal suggested something far more significant lay concealed within its weathered walls. As Thomas began investigating his great-great-grandfather's history, he uncovered surprising inconsistencies in the family narrative. Jeremiah Caldwell hadn't been merely a successful homesteader. County records and archived letters revealed that before establishing the ranch, he had worked closely with several prominent inventors and engineers of the Reconstruction era. Correspondence fragments mentioned connections to workshops associated with figures like Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, though Jeremiah's specific role remained frustratingly unclear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even more puzzling were the shipping manifests Thomas discovered among his father's papers, documenting the arrival of sophisticated mechanical components from industrial centers across the eastern seaboard, precision-machined. Parts, specialized tools, and materials that seemed entirely unnecessary for a grain storage facility on a frontier Montana ranch. The manifests listed items that would have represented cutting-edge mechanical technology for the 1870s, raising questions about their intended purpose and how a relatively modest rancher could have acquired them. As winter deepened and the unexplained phenomena around the silo intensified, Thomas knew he needed to investigate the structure's mysterious lower chambers, which had remained sealed since Jeremiah's time, their contents unknown to generations of Caldwells. What he would discover behind those aged wooden panels would not only transform his understanding of his family's legacy, but would force historians and engineers to reconsider everything they thought they knew about America's technological development. During the Reconstruction era, the Caldwell Ranch had always carried a certain mystique among locals. Even as neighboring properties succumbed to corporate consolidation, there remained something defiantly independent about the weathered buildings and the family that stubbornly maintained them against mounting odds. The imposing stone silo, visible for miles across the valley, had become a symbol of that persistence, a monument to a different era of American agriculture. Thomas had inherited not just land and buildings, but a deep connection to the property that transcended rational explanation. On still mornings, walking the perimeter of his remaining acreage, he sometimes felt as though the land itself was trying to communicate something essential, some secret that had waited generations to be revealed. His grandfather Victor had spoken of similar feelings before his death 20 years earlier. "This land holds stories, Thomas," the old man had said, gazing toward the silo from his porch rocking chair. "Not just our family's stories, but something deeper. Jeremiah knew that's why he built the way he did. Foundations matter more than what shows above ground." At the time, Thomas had attributed these comments to an old man's sentimentality. But as he studied Jeremiah's journal by lamplight in his study, different interpretations emerged. The technical drawings, far more sophisticated than should have been possible for a man with Jeremiah's limited formal education, suggested knowledge well beyond typical agricultural engineering of the 1870s. The precision of the measurements, the complexity of the mechanical systems, the advanced metallurgical specifications, all pointed to expertise that seemed anachronistic for a frontier rancher of that era. Eleanor, whose historical research had often focused on technological developments during the Reconstruction period, found herself equally puzzled by Jeremiah's writings. "These concepts," she said, studying a particularly detailed schematic, "they're utilizing principles that weren't commonly understood until decades later. Look at these energy transfer calculations. They're remarkably advanced." Jessica's university connections provided additional context that deepened the mystery. Her professor, Dr. Harrison Chen, a specialist in historical engineering techniques, examined photographs of the journal pages with growing amazement. "These designs incorporate theoretical approaches that wouldn't become mainstream until the early 20th century, he explained during a video call. "If these dates are accurate, your ancestor was working with concepts that were revolutionary for his time." The journal contained tantalizing references to Jeremiah's experiences during the Civil War, not as a common soldier as family law had maintained, but as part of a specialized Union engineering corps tasked with developing advanced mechanical systems. Several entries mentioned a classified project involving self-sustaining energy systems and collaborations with inventors whose names had been carefully encoded rather than stated directly. There was significant classified engineering work during the Civil War that remains poorly documented, Dr. Chen explained. Both Union and Confederate forces invested heavily in technological innovation, but much of this research was either deliberately obscured for security reasons or simply lost in the chaos of the post-war period. The more Thomas learned about Jeremiah, the more the traditional family narrative unraveled. The humble homesteader who had established a frontier ranch was transforming into someone far more complex, a skilled engineer with connections to the highest levels of industrial innovation during a pivotal period in American technological development. The ranch itself took on new significance as well. Its location, which had always seemed a matter of happenstance, now appeared deliberately chosen, situated at the convergence of natural features that could potentially provide specific resources needed for whatever Jeremiah had been developing. The property's unusual boundaries, which followed no obvious geographical logic, began to suggest a pattern related to the technical specifications in the journal. As Thomas continued his investigation, strange occurrences around the property intensified. Electrical equipment experienced unexplainable fluctuations when operated near the silo. Compass needles deviated unpredictably in its vicinity. Most disturbing were the dreams, vivid, detailed visions that came to Thomas night after night, featuring mechanical systems and devices he had never seen but somehow recognized, as though some ancestral memory were struggling to surface. Eleanor found him one morning before dawn, standing beside the silo in his pajamas and boots, tracing patterns on the stonework with his fingers. "I was sleepwalking," he explained, embarrassed, "dreaming about mechanisms hidden in the walls." The ranch's financial situation continued its precarious decline. The previous season's drought had reduced their wheat yield to barely 60% of projections. Equipment repairs had depleted their operating reserves. The property tax assessment had increased again, reflecting the rising value of agricultural land in the valley as Heartland Industries continued its expansion. Michael, whose business education had given him a clear-eyed view of their financial reality, laid out the numbers without sentimentality. "We've got maybe 2 seasons left at this rate," he concluded, closing the ranch's ledger with a decisive thump. 3 if we're exceptionally lucky with weather and market prices, which hasn't been our pattern lately. Heartland Industries had made another offer the previous week, their third in 18 months. The figure was substantial, reflecting the corporation's determination to acquire the last significant independent operation in the valley. The papers sat unsigned in Thomas's desk drawer, representing both salvation from mounting debt and the end of 5 generations of Caldwell stewardship. Jessica had returned for the weekend from the university, bringing additional scanning equipment to document the silo's anomalous energy patterns. "Whatever's causing these readings, it's not diminishing," she reported, comparing current data with her measurements from the previous month. "If anything, the energy signatures are intensifying as the temperature drops." The family gathered around the kitchen table that evening, the conversation inevitably turning to the silo and its mysteries. Michael, despite his pragmatism, had become reluctantly intrigued by the mounting evidence that the structure held secrets beyond its agricultural purpose. "Even if there is something valuable hidden in there, will it matter?" he asked, voicing the question that haunted them all. "The Heartland offer expires in 30 days. Whatever Jeremiah built, is it worth risking our future to uncover it?" Thomas studied his son's face, so like his own at that age, carrying the same blend of Caldwell features that connected him back through generations to Jeremiah himself. "I believe," he said slowly, "that our future and this discovery might be more connected than we realize. Jeremiah built to last, not just the structure, but whatever it contains. He wouldn't have gone to such lengths unless it mattered beyond his lifetime." Eleanor placed her hand over her husband's. "Tomorrow," she said, "we open it tomorrow. Whatever's in there, we face it together." That night, as winter winds howled across the valley, Thomas dreamed more vividly than ever before, not of mechanisms this time, but of Jeremiah himself, standing before the newly completed silo in 1873, speaking words that echoed across time. "When the need is greatest, the legacy awakens. What sleeps within is not just invention, but salvation." The morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the temperature hovering near zero as the family prepared to access the silo's sealed chambers. Thomas had studied the journal extensively, identifying what appeared to be hidden access instructions encoded within seemingly routine maintenance notes. The entry point wasn't the obvious main door, long since secured with modern padlocks, but a concealed panel near the foundation, its existence disguised by the careful arrangement of the surrounding stonework. Jessica's equipment detected the strongest energy signatures emanating from precisely this location, confirming Thomas's interpretation of Jeremiah's cryptic directions. The family worked methodically, removing accumulated soil and debris from around the base of the structure, exposing stonework that had remained untouched for generations. "Look at this craftsmanship," Eleanor marveled, brushing soil from the precisely fitted stones. "These aren't just random rocks. They're cut to interlock perfectly. This level of masonry would have been extraordinary for a frontier ranch in the 1870s. Following the journal's encoded instructions, Thomas located almost imperceptible markings on specific stones, tiny symbols that matched illustrations in Jeremiah's notes. Pressing these in a particular sequence as described in the journal caused a section of the stonework to shift slightly, with the sound of long dormant mechanisms activating within the walls. A rectangular panel, approximately 3 feet wide by 4 feet high, separated from the surrounding stone, swinging outward with surprising ease despite a century and a half without use. The space beyond revealed a narrow tunnel that, according to all conventional understanding of the silo's architecture, simply shouldn't exist. "The silo's external dimensions don't allow for this," Jessica whispered, shining her flashlight into the opening. "This tunnel would intersect with the main grain storage area based on all existing plans." The passage beyond was lined not with rough stone, but with precisely fitted metal panels, showing remarkably little corrosion despite their age. The air that flowed from the opening carried a strange scent, not the expected mustiness of a long-sealed space, but something almost electrical, reminiscent of the atmosphere after a lightning strike. Thomas led the way, following the narrow tunnel as it curved gently downward, extending well beyond the silo's apparent footprint. Jessica's instruments recorded increasingly strong energy readings as they progressed, while compasses spun uselessly, their needles whirling in erratic circles. After approximately 30 feet, the tunnel opened into a chamber that defied all expectations. The circular room, easily 20 feet in diameter, lay directly beneath the silo, but connected to it through no visible means from above. The walls were lined with intricate copper and brass machinery, polished wooden panels, and glass-fronted gauges that somehow remained intact after a century and a half. Most astonishing was what occupied the center of the chamber, a massive device of incomprehensible purpose, its brass and iron components arranged in concentric rings around a central column that pulsed with a soft blue-white light. The machine hummed with quiet but unmistakable power, its mechanisms moving in precise, hypnotic patterns. Thomas stood transfixed, recognition dawning as he realized he had seen this exact device in his dreams. Every gear, every lever, every gleaming component exactly as his sleeping mind had somehow known them to be. "It's been running," he whispered, "all this time, for 150 years. Across the chamber, a wooden desk held more of Jeremiah's journals, not hidden fragments this time, but complete volumes documenting the creation of what he had called the perpetual engine. As the family gathered around these unexpected treasures, they began to understand that what they had discovered wasn't just a curious historical artifact or clever mechanical novelty. It was something that would change everything, not just for the Caldwell Ranch, but potentially for the future of energy production itself. A technology developed in secret during the turbulent aftermath of the Civil War, hidden away not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too well. And as Thomas placed his hand on the gently humming machine his ancestor had built a century and a half earlier, he couldn't help but wonder why such a revolutionary creation had been concealed, rather than celebrated, and what consequences might follow from bringing Jeremiah Caldwell's remarkable invention back into the light of day. Thomas Caldwell's situation had deteriorated rapidly in the months preceding his discovery. The Montana farming landscape had transformed almost beyond recognition during his lifetime. What had once been a patchwork of diverse family operations was now predominantly controlled by heartland agricultural industries, whose mechanized efficiency and economies of scale had steadily pushed independent farmers to the brink of extinction. The Caldwell Ranch, once the pride of White Pine County, now struggled against forces that seemed both impersonal and unstoppable. At the kitchen table that morning, Eleanor organized unpaid invoices into careful stacks, while their son Michael calculated potential scenarios for the upcoming planting season. Their daughter Jessica joined via video call from her university laboratory, her concerned expression visible even on the small screen of Thomas's aging laptop. "The irrigation pump replacement alone is $22,000, Eleanor said softly, placing an estimate atop the largest pile. "And that's assuming we can find someone willing to repair the existing system, rather than installing entirely new equipment." Michael's expression remained stoic as he adjusted figures in his spreadsheet. The business degree that had once promised to help modernize the family operation now primarily served to quantify the exact dimensions of their financial predicament. Even with perfect weather and optimal yield, we'd be operating at a 5% loss based on projected market prices. Factor in the equipment repairs and loan payments. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The financial reality had become increasingly clear. Without significant intervention, the Caldwell Ranch would not survive another 2 seasons. The land that had sustained 5 generations would slip away. Another chapter closed in the steady decline of American family farming. "The Heartland offer arrived yesterday," Thomas said, reaching for the envelope he'd left unopened on the counter. "Their third in 18 months. Jessica's voice came through the laptop speakers. "How much this time?" Thomas opened the envelope and scanned the document inside. The figure caused a momentary silence around the table. Heartland Industries knew the Caldwells were running out of options and had increased their offer accordingly. The amount would clear all outstanding debts, provide a comfortable retirement for Thomas and Eleanor, and leave substantial funds for both children's futures. "It's enough," Michael said finally. "More than fair market value." Eleanor reached for her husband's hand. "Whatever you decide, we stand together." Thomas folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. "We have 21 days to respond." The weight of multi-generational responsibility pressed down on Thomas's shoulders as he walked the property later that morning. The early spring sunshine illuminated a ranch that, despite its financial troubles, still resonated with the accumulated care of 5 generations. Stone walls his grandfather had constructed still defined western pasture boundaries. The maple grove his father had planted as a windbreak had matured into a stately corridor of living architecture. Everywhere he looked, Thomas saw not just land and buildings, but the physical manifestation of his ancestors' hopes and labors. The silo dominated the visual landscape, a monument to Jeremiah's vision and determination. Standing in its shadow, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what his great-great-grandfather would advise in this moment of crisis. Would he counsel acceptance of changing times, or would he advocate for resistance against seemingly inevitable forces? That evening, as Montana's expansive sky transformed through deepening shades of purple and crimson, Thomas returned to Jeremiah's journal, searching for guidance across the generations. The technical drawings and specifications remained largely incomprehensible, but interspersed between them were philosophical reflections that seemed to speak directly to Thomas's current predicament. "True independence," Jeremiah had written, in August 1872, "cannot exist without self-sufficiency in essential resources. Those who control fundamental necessities will invariably control those dependent upon them. The perpetual engine represents not merely a mechanical achievement, but liberation from systems of dependency that inevitably lead to exploitation." Another entry, dated March 1873, as the silo's construction neared completion, revealed even more of Jeremiah's motivation. "My colleagues argue that releasing our discovery would destabilize existing power structures too rapidly, creating chaos, rather than progress. Perhaps they are correct that society requires gradual transition. I cannot accept, however, that this knowledge should remain forever hidden. I build this repository not to bury our creation, but to preserve it until circumstances prove more favorable for its emergence. What we have created belongs not to us, but to humanity's future." These passages transformed Thomas's understanding of both the silo and his inheritance. Whatever lay hidden within wasn't merely a curious historical artifact. It represented Jeremiah's deliberate attempt to safeguard knowledge that he believed could fundamentally change the relationship between ordinary people and the economic power structures that govern their lives. The similarity to Thomas's current circumstances was startling. Just as his ancestor had faced powerful industrial forces during the tumultuous post-Civil War period, the Caldwell Ranch now confronted the seemingly unstoppable tide of corporate agriculture. The parallel was too precise to be coincidental, raising the possibility that Jeremiah had foreseen a time when his descendants would face similar challenges on fundamentally different scales. After sharing these journal entries with his family, a new sense of purpose emerged in their discussions about the silo's mysteries. What had begun as historical curiosity now felt like a potential lifeline, not just to understanding their past, but possibly to securing their future. Even if there is something revolutionary inside, Michael cautioned, his business training fostering pragmatic skepticism, we need to be realistic about what 150-year-old technology could possibly offer in today's world. Whatever Jeremiah created would be hopelessly obsolete by modern standards. Jessica's perspective differed significantly. That assumes linear technological progression, she countered. But history is full of examples of innovative paths abandoned not because they were inferior, but because they threatened established interests. The early 20th century saw fierce competition between electric, steam, and gasoline-powered vehicles. Gasoline didn't win because it was inherently superior. It won because of infrastructure investments, manufacturing capabilities, and business alliances. The next morning brought unexpected complications. A black SUV with government plates arrived at the ranch, carrying two representatives from the Department of Energy's Historical Technologies Division, a department Thomas had never heard of. They introduced themselves as Dr. Amelia Rivera and Agent Carson Fletcher, presenting credentials that seemed authentic but oddly non-specific about their exact governmental authority. "Mr. Caldwell," Dr. Rivera began, after declining offers of coffee, "we understand you've been investigating unusual energy signatures emanating from a pre-industrial structure on your property. We'd like to discuss what you've found." The question of how they knew about the family's private investigation hung in the air, unsettling in its implications. Thomas measured his response carefully. "We've noticed some unusual thermal patterns in an old agricultural building. Nothing particularly noteworthy." Agent Fletcher's expression remained professionally neutral. "Satellite thermal imaging detected anomalous energy patterns consistent with certain classified historical technologies. As a matter of national security, we're required to investigate such occurrences. We'd appreciate your cooperation in showing us the structure in question." Eleanor, whose history background had fostered healthy skepticism toward government overreach, intervened with professional courtesy. "I believe you'll need a warrant for any formal inspection. While we're happy to discuss general historical aspects of our property, specific investigations would require proper legal documentation." A tense negotiation followed, culminating in the visitor's departure with promises to return with appropriate authorization. As their vehicle disappeared down the long driveway, the family gathered in the kitchen to assess this alarming development. "How could they possibly know what we've found?" Jessica asked. "We haven't shared our findings with anyone except Dr. Chen, and he wouldn't—" "It's not what we've found," Thomas interrupted, realization dawning. "It's what's been there all along. Whatever's in that silo has been emitting energy patterns for decades, possibly centuries. The only thing that's changed is the government's ability to detect them from orbit." This revelation added new urgency to their investigation. If government agencies were taking interest in the silo, others might soon follow. The 21-day window for deciding on Heartland's offer suddenly seemed dangerously inadequate. That night, Thomas made a decision. Rather than waiting for external pressures to force their hand, the family would accelerate their exploration of the silo's secret chamber. Jessica arranged an emergency leave from the university, arriving home the following evening with additional scanning equipment, and Dr. Chen, whose expertise in historical engineering had proven invaluable. The Caldwell's financial situation continued its precarious decline. A letter from their bank arrived, indicating that their operating loan payment extension request had been denied. Without significant cash infusion within 60 days, foreclosure. Proceedings would begin on equipment that was essential for the upcoming planting season. Michael approached his father as they completed evening chores. "Dad, I've been thinking about contingencies. If we accept the Heartland offer, we could negotiate to lease back a portion of the property, including the silo. That would give us ongoing access to continue the investigation while resolving the immediate financial crisis." Thomas appreciated his son's practical approach, even as he resisted the underlying premise. "Your great-great-grandfather built something meant to last generations. I don't believe he intended for us to surrender it the moment understanding was within reach." "Sometimes survival requires strategic retreat," Michael countered. "Jeremiah was a military man. He would have understood that." Their conversation was interrupted by Jessica's excited call from the workshop, where she and Dr. Chen had been analyzing components recovered from the hidden chamber. The family gathered around a workbench where several brass and copper mechanisms lay partially disassembled. "You won't believe this," Jessica said, her voice tense with excitement. "These components, they're not just advanced for the 1870s. They're utilizing principles that modern engineering is only beginning to explore. The metallurgical composition alone is decades ahead of what should have been possible." Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. "The precision of these mechanical governors, we're seeing tolerances that would be challenging even with modern CNC manufacturing. And these electromagnetic components demonstrate understanding of principles that weren't formally documented until the early 20th century." "What exactly does that mean?" Eleanor asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Jessica and Dr. Chen exchanged glances before she answered. "It means that whatever Jeremiah and his colleagues created wasn't just ahead of its time. It represents an entirely different trajectory of technological development. Not just an innovative device, but a fundamentally different approach to energy, generation, and mechanical efficiency." Thomas recalled passages from Jeremiah's journal about paths not taken and roads deliberately obscured. The implications were staggering, that his ancestor had participated in developing alternative technologies that had been systematically erased from historical record, their potential deliberately suppressed. "But why hide something so valuable?" Michael asked, the business implications immediately apparent to him. The patents alone would have been worth fortunes. Dr. Chen offered a historian's perspective. The post-Civil War period saw unprecedented consolidation of industrial power. Technologies that threatened established interests often disappeared mysteriously, their inventors bought out, discredited, or worse. Your ancestor may have chosen concealment as the only way to preserve his work for future generations. Following days brought intensive investigation of both the hidden chamber and Jeremiah's journals. Each revelation added new dimensions to their understanding of what they'd discovered. The perpetual engine appeared to be a revolutionary energy system that generated consistent power through principles that blended mechanical efficiency, electromagnetic induction, and what Jeremiah had cryptically termed harmonic resonance, with natural energy fields. Most remarkably, the device had apparently operated continuously since its installation, requiring no fuel or external inputs, a closed system that defied conventional understanding of thermodynamics. The engineering principles incorporated were so fundamentally different from standard approaches that Dr. Chen struggled to translate them into modern scientific terminology. It's like discovering that someone built a functional airplane in 1875, he explained to the family. Not just theoretically sound, but actually working for a century and a half with minimal degradation. This isn't just ahead of its time. It represents an entirely alternative technological evolution. The implications extended far beyond historical curiosity. If the principles behind the perpetual engine could be understood and replicated, they might offer solutions to contemporary energy challenges. Clean, self-sustaining power systems operating without fuel or significant environmental impact. As Thomas contemplated these possibilities, a parallel investigation into Jeremiah's history revealed more about the origins of the hidden technology. His ancestor hadn't worked alone. He had been part of a network of innovative thinkers who called themselves the Liberty Engineers, a coalition of Union veterans who believed technological self-sufficiency was essential to preserving the democratic ideals they had fought to defend. Letters coded within Jeremiah's personal correspondence revealed connections to now-forgotten inventors across the nation, each apparently working on complementary technologies designed to free ordinary citizens from dependency on industrial monopolies. These innovators had deliberately operated in the shadows, recognizing that powerful interests would view their work as threatening to emerging corporate dominance. The more they learned, the more Thomas understood that what they had discovered wasn't just a historical curiosity or potential financial windfall. It was the physical embodiment of an alternative vision for America's technological development. One that prioritized individual independence over centralized control, sustainability over consumption, and distributed prosperity over concentrated wealth. This realization transformed their approach to both the silo and their immediate challenges. The Heartland offer, which had seemed a potential lifeline, now carried implications beyond mere property transfer. If corporate interests learned what the silo contained, they might well ensure the technology remained buried for another century. Thomas's conviction deepened with each passing day. They weren't just fighting to save a family ranch. They were working to fulfill Jeremiah's vision, to introduce transformative technology at a moment when humanity desperately needed alternatives to systems that were proving unsustainable. "This changes everything," he told his family as they gathered around the kitchen table one evening. Jeremiah didn't hide this technology because it failed. He preserved it because the world wasn't ready. He was waiting for a moment when the need was great enough to overcome the resistance. Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. "And you believe that moment is now?" "Look around us," Thomas replied. "Family farms vanishing, rural communities collapsing, corporations controlling the fundamental necessities of life. Meanwhile, environmental crises multiply while we remain chained to energy systems we know are destructive. If not now, when? Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines by the sound, and moving with purpose rather than caution. Thomas reached the front porch in time to see 3 government SUVs and what appeared to be specialized equipment trucks turning into their long driveway. Agent Fletcher emerged from the lead vehicle, accompanied by Dr. Rivera and several individuals. In tactical gear, he approached with a document in hand. "Mr. Caldwell, this is a federal warrant authorizing inspection and potential containment of unregistered historical technology. We'll need immediate access to your property, specifically the structure identified in our previous visit." Thomas stood at the threshold of his family home, the warrant heavy in his hands as personnel began unloading equipment. Behind him, Eleanor was already making urgent phone calls to legal contacts, while Michael and Jessica secured critical journal pages and smaller components from their workshop. Dr. Chen approached Agent Fletcher, presenting his university credentials. "As a registered historical technology consultant, I'd like to formally note my involvement with this site. Any investigation should follow established protocols for potentially significant historical artifacts." This intervention bought precious minutes, as Fletcher was forced to consult with superiors about proper procedural response to an academic presence. Thomas used this time to send Jessica with a selected journal and critical mechanical components through the back entrance, instructing her to secure these items with trusted university colleagues. As government personnel established a perimeter around the silo, Thomas faced a decision point that would determine not just his family's future, but potentially the path of technological development itself. The forces assembling around his ancestral property represented powerful interests that had suppressed Jeremiah's innovation for generations. The question wasn't simply whether Thomas could prevent them from taking control of the silo and its contents. It was whether he and his family could ensure that this time the technology would fulfill its intended purpose rather than disappearing once again into classified obscurity. Standing in the lengthening shadow of the silo as the Montana sun began its descent, Thomas recalled a final passage from Jeremiah's journal. "I entrust this creation not to institutions or authorities, but to those who share my blood and, I hope, my values. When the moment comes for revelation, remember that no machine, however ingenious, matters more than the purpose it serves. The perpetual engine was built not merely to generate power, but to empower those who would otherwise be powerless. Its true potential lies not in its mechanisms, but in its meaning." With government officials advancing across his property and corporate interests circling like distant vultures, Thomas Caldwell prepared to defend not just a family legacy, but a vision of technological development that had waited a century and a half for its moment of emergence. The ancient silo, silhouetted against the darkening sky, stood as a monument to both past innovation and future possibility, a bridge across time connecting one generation's revolutionary vision with another's desperate need. What happened next would determine whether Jeremiah's creation would finally fulfill its intended purpose or be consigned once again to secrecy and suppression. For Thomas, the path forward was increasingly clear. His ancestor hadn't preserved this technology merely to save a family farm. He had secured it for a moment when its principles might change the course of human development. That moment, it seemed, had finally arrived. As Agent Fletcher approached, with a team of technicians, Thomas made a decision that would alter not just his family's trajectory, but potentially the future of energy technology itself. The true test of Jeremiah's legacy was about to begin, and with it, a struggle for control of a vision that had waited 150 years for its moment of revelation. The discovery within the silo's hidden chamber unfolded gradually over the following days, each revelation more astonishing than the last. While government officials established surveillance positions along the property boundaries, maintaining their distance but clearly monitoring all activity, Thomas and his family worked relentlessly to understand exactly what Jeremiah had created and preserved. Dr. Chen's expertise proved invaluable as they carefully documented and analyzed the massive device at the chamber's center. "This isn't just one invention," he explained, examining intricate interconnections between various mechanical systems. "It's an integrated network of innovations, each remarkable in its own right, but together forming something revolutionary." The central component, what Jeremiah had called the perpetual engine, defied conventional engineering principles. Its concentric brass rings rotated at varying speeds around a luminous core, generating consistent energy through what appeared to be electromagnetic induction, coupled with mechanical systems of extraordinary precision. "The materials alone are inexplicable," Dr. Chen said, examining metal components under a portable microscope. "These alloys shouldn't have been possible to create in the 1870s. The molecular structure suggests manufacturing techniques that weren't developed until the mid-20th century, if then. Most remarkably, the device operated with virtually no degradation despite running continuously for nearly 150 years. Jeremiah's journals revealed that he and his collaborators had developed specialized metallurgical techniques, allowing components to maintain structural integrity through countless operational cycles. "It's not perpetual motion in the strict sense," Jessica explained, translating complex technical specifications from Jeremiah's notes. "It's harvesting ambient energy sources, geomagnetic fields, minor temperature differentials, even subtle vibrations from Earth's crust, but the efficiency is astounding, far beyond anything in modern systems." As they worked to understand the technology, the family also pieced together the historical context of its creation. Jeremiah's complete journals, secured in a hermetically sealed compartment within the chamber, provided extensive documentation of the Liberty Engineers, a nationwide network of innovative thinkers who had emerged from the Civil War determined to prevent the industrial monopolies they saw forming across America. "They recognized the pattern," Eleanor said, examining historical correspondence between Jeremiah and his associates. They witnessed how railroad corporations were consolidating control over transportation, how industrial combines were monopolizing manufacturing, how financial institutions were manipulating access to capital. They saw ordinary citizens being transformed from independent producers into dependent consumers. The Liberty Engineers had developed technologies specifically designed to counter this centralization of power, innovations that would allow communities to maintain independence from emerging corporate systems. Jeremiah's perpetual engine represented their crowning achievement, an energy source that required no fuel, minimal maintenance, and could operate indefinitely at scales ranging from individual homesteads to entire communities. They weren't just inventors, Thomas realized, reading passages that revealed the group's philosophical foundations. They were visionaries trying to preserve a particular version of American democracy, one where economic independence underpinned political freedom. The journals documented how the group had faced escalating opposition as their work progressed. Several members had experienced mysterious laboratory fires. Others found their funding suddenly revoked, and some faced professional discreditation through manufactured scandals. When one prominent member died under suspicious circumstances, after refusing a substantial buyout for his patents, the remaining engineers made a fateful decision. Rather than releasing their technologies immediately, Thomas explained to his family, they chose to preserve their innovations in secure locations across the country, concealed within seemingly ordinary structures on properties owned by trusted members. Jeremiah's silo was one of 7 repositories established nationwide, each containing aspects of the Liberty Engineers' most significant work. The locations were carefully chosen to ensure geographical distribution and placed under the stewardship of families committed to the group's ideals of technological independence and distributed prosperity. They weren't hiding their work from humanity, Eleanor noted, pointing to specific journal passages. They were protecting it until conditions would allow for its proper implementation, when society could embrace the benefits without the innovations being destroyed or monopolized by existing power structures. The most sobering journal entries detailed how industrial interests had systematically erased the Liberty Engineers from historical record, discrediting their published work, suppressing their patents, and ensuring their contributions remained forgotten by subsequent generations. What few references survived had been dismissed as exaggerated claims or technological dead ends. As the 3rd day of intensive investigation concluded, Michael posed the question that had been gradually forming in everyone's mind. So what do we actually do with this discovery? The implications were both exhilarating and intimidating. The technology hidden within the silo could potentially revolutionize energy production at every scale, from individual homes to global systems. It represented a path toward truly sustainable power generation without environmental degradation or resource depletion. But the forces that had suppressed these innovations in the 1870s had only grown more powerful and entrenched in the intervening century and a half. Thomas stood beside the gently humming perpetual engine, his hand resting on brass components that had maintained their luster despite operating continuously since before his grandfather's birth. Jeremiah didn't preserve this just for our family's benefit. This was meant for humanity when the moment was right. "And you believe that moment is now?" Dr. Chen asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "Look at our world. Corporate control more concentrated than even the Liberty Engineers could have imagined. Environmental systems under unprecedented strain. Communities everywhere losing independence through engineered dependency. If not now, when?" Their discussion was interrupted by Jessica, who had been monitoring surveillance equipment they'd established around the property perimeter. "We've got movement. Multiple vehicles approaching from the county road, government plates but different from yesterday's visitors." External pressures were intensifying faster than anticipated. Thomas made rapid decisions, assigning critical tasks to each family member. Michael would secure digital copies of all documentation on multiple devices. Eleanor would contact university colleagues with expertise in historical patent law. Jessica and Dr. Chen would prepare comprehensive technical documentation of the perpetual engine's core principles. "What about you?" Eleanor asked, recognizing the determined set of her husband's jaw. "I'm going to make sure we control the narrative from this point forward," Thomas replied, reaching for his phone. "The government thinks they're investigating an anomalous energy signature. They have no idea they're about to encounter the most significant technological rediscovery in modern history." Thomas made 3 calls in rapid succession. To Congresswoman Diana Martinez, whose family had farmed in the adjacent county for generations, to Sylvia Okafor at the Regional Environmental Sustainability Alliance, and finally to James Harrington, a technology correspondent for the National Science Monitor, whose recent articles had critically examined corporate control of emerging energy systems. Within 2 hours, we'll have witnesses whose combined presence will make it impossible for this discovery to disappear into classified obscurity, Thomas explained. Government agencies can suppress information, but not when it's simultaneously being observed by elected officials, environmental advocates, and national media. As government vehicles approached the property, Thomas gathered his family in the hidden chamber for a final moment of private decision-making. "Once we take this step, there's no returning to our previous lives. Are we prepared for what follows?" Eleanor took his hand firmly. Jeremiah didn't preserve this knowledge for it to remain hidden. He was waiting for descendants with the courage to complete what he began. Jessica nodded her agreement. Scientific advancement isn't just about discovery. It's about ensuring beneficial innovations actually reach humanity. The Liberty engineers understood that. So do we. "From a business perspective," Michael added, with a wry smile that couldn't quite mask his underlying emotion, "we're sitting on the most valuable intellectual property in energy production history. Our negotiating position is considerably stronger than it was with Heartland's offer." As the family ascended from the hidden chamber to meet the approaching officials, they carried not just documentation of a remarkable historical artifact, but the physical embodiment of an alternative technological path, one that offered solutions to challenges their ancestor could have glimpsed only in their earliest formations, but which had now reached critical proportions. The caravan of government. Vehicles arrived at the farmhouse just as Congresswoman Martinez's helicopter appeared on the horizon. Thomas stepped onto the porch, Jeremiah's primary journal held carefully in his hands, ready to introduce the world to an innovation that had waited a century and a half for its moment of emergence. Agent Fletcher emerged from the lead vehicle, his expression tightening at the sight of the approaching helicopter. "Mr. Caldwell, we have authorization to secure this property immediately. Any interference with federal operations could result in serious legal consequences." Thomas stood his ground, projecting a calm confidence that belied the tension of the moment. "Agent Fletcher, in approximately 90 seconds, you'll be conducting your investigation under the direct observation of a sitting member of Congress, regional environmental advocates, and national media. I suggest we all proceed with transparency as the guiding principle." The standoff that followed transformed rapidly as additional participants arrived. Congresswoman Martinez, whose family had experienced similar corporate pressure on their multi-generational farm, brought political protection that even federal agencies hesitated to challenge directly. Sylvia Okafor arrived with a team of environmental engineers who immediately recognized the implications of the perpetual engine for clean energy development. James Harrington began live-streaming preliminary findings to his 2 million followers, ensuring the discovery couldn't be easily contained. Dr. Chen presented the assembled officials and observers with preliminary technical documentation. What we've discovered isn't merely a historical curiosity. It's a fully functional energy generation system that has operated continuously since 1873, requiring no fuel input and producing no waste byproducts. The implications for contemporary energy challenges are difficult to overstate. The government response fractured visibly as different agencies represented on-site recognized conflicting institutional interests. Department of Energy scientists showed unmistakable excitement at the technological implications, while security officials appeared concerned about potential disruption to existing energy infrastructure and national security protocols. This technology was deliberately suppressed in the 1870s, Eleanor explained to the assembled group, presenting historical documentation from Jeremiah's journals. The Liberty engineers faced systematic opposition from industrial interests who recognized that truly independent energy production would fundamentally alter power relationships throughout society. Congresswoman Martinez, examining the perpetual engine with evident amazement, addressed Agent Fletcher directly. "I'll be informing the Congressional Science Committee about this discovery immediately. Any attempt to classify or restrict access to this technology will face intensive legislative scrutiny." James Harrington's livestream had already attracted hundreds of thousands of viewers, with energy experts around the world beginning to comment on the footage of Jeremiah's creation. "The response is overwhelming," he reported, scanning incoming messages on his tablet. "I'm receiving corroboration from engineers globally that these principles could revolutionize our entire approach to energy production." By nightfall, the situation had evolved beyond anyone's ability to contain. Additional media outlets had arrived, setting up satellite trucks along the property boundary. University researchers from 3 states were en route to document the discovery. Social media channels overflowed with discussion about the implications of a 150-year-old technology that outperformed modern energy systems in efficiency, sustainability, and durability. Thomas found a quiet moment with his family as the activity swirled around them. "This is exactly what Jeremiah intended," he said, watching as teams of scientists reverently examined his ancestors' creation. Not just the preservation of technology, but its emergence at a moment when humanity could recognize its true value. The perpetual engine's principles were already being analyzed by engineers worldwide as digital documentation spread across academic networks. The Liberty engineers' vision, long suppressed and forgotten, was finally reaching the audience they had always intended, humanity itself. Dr. Rivera, who had initially arrived as part of the government containment team, approached Thomas with evident conflict in her expression. "For what it's worth, Mr. Caldwell, there are those of us within the department who have suspected something like this existed. There have been rumors for decades about suppressed technologies from the post-Civil War period. Finding confirmation, interprofessionally vindicating, if politically complicated." As midnight approached, Thomas stood alone beside the silo, gazing up at its imposing silhouette against the star-filled Montana sky. The structure that had dominated his family's property for generations, that had seemed an architectural curiosity at best and a financial burden at worst, now stood revealed as perhaps the most important historical preservation project in American history. Jeremiah's voice seemed to echo across time through journal passages Thomas had committed to memory. I build not merely for my children's children, but for a future where technology serves humanity's liberation rather than its dependency. When the moment comes for revelation, remember that true innovation measures its value not in profits generated, but in lives enhanced. The following morning brought a development that even Thomas hadn't anticipated. As news of the discovery spread, reports began emerging from other locations across the country, properties where similar anomalous energy signatures had been detected, each corresponding to locations mentioned in Jeremiah's journals as repositories established by other Liberty engineers. In rural Pennsylvania, a family discovered hidden chambers beneath what they had always believed to be a traditional bank barn. In Colorado, historical preservationists investigating an abandoned mining operation found sealed rooms containing machinery that matched Jeremiah's technical specifications. Near Sacramento, California, renovation of a Victorian-era mansion revealed concealed spaces housing components that generated energy patterns identical to those emanating from the Montana silo. Their awakening, Jessica realized, correlating these reports with Jeremiah's documentation. The repositories aren't just physically connected, they're responding to each other's activation. The Liberty engineers created a distributed network long before the concept existed in computing. Government agencies found themselves overwhelmed by the scale and distribution of the emerging discoveries. What might have been containable as an isolated phenomenon became impossible to suppress when manifesting simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions, each with different local authorities, media coverage, and public engagement. Corporate response proved equally fragmented. Energy conglomerates dispatched representatives offering extraordinary sums for exclusive development rights, while simultaneously consulting with legal teams about potential patent challenges. Financial markets reflected growing uncertainty about long-term energy investments as analysts began calculating the implications of the Liberty engineers' technologies for existing infrastructure. Heartland Industries' CEO personally visited the Caldwell Ranch, arriving via private helicopter rather than through formal channels. Howard Parker, whose company had systematically acquired neighboring properties over decades, found himself in the unexpected position of supplicant rather than power broker. "The offer we discussed previously," he began, seated across from Thomas at the kitchen table, where generations of Caldwells had made decisions about their land, was clearly inadequate given recent developments. We're prepared to increase it substantially, with additional provisions for ongoing family involvement in whatever technological applications emerge. Thomas studied the man whose corporate expansion had steadily encroached on his family's existence. "Mr. Parker, I don't believe you understand the fundamental nature of what we've discovered. This technology wasn't preserved to become another corporate asset. It was hidden specifically to prevent that outcome." "Everything has its price, Mr. Caldwell," Parker responded with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to refusal. "Name yours." Thomas smiled slightly. "That's precisely the worldview Jeremiah and the Liberty engineers were working to overcome. the belief that everything and everyone can be bought. Some things belong not to individuals or corporations, but to humanity's future. The perpetual engine is one of those things. By the end of the week, the Caldwell Ranch had transformed from a struggling agricultural operation into the focal point of what media outlets were calling the Liberty Engineers Renaissance. Teams of researchers worked to document every aspect of Jeremiah's creation, while family members from other repository sites arrived to compare findings and share historical documentation preserved by their own ancestors. Most significantly, open-source engineering collaboratives had already begun replicating core principles of the technology, developing prototypes that confirmed the perpetual engine's fundamental approach could be adapted to contemporary materials and manufacturing techniques. What had been preserved was proving not merely historically significant, but immediately applicable to current challenges. Thomas found Jessica in the hidden chamber late one evening, making final adjustments to comprehensive documentation systems they had established. "What do you think Jeremiah would make of all this?" she asked, looking up from her work. Thomas considered this as he gazed at the perpetual engine, still humming with the same quiet efficiency it had maintained since before his grandfather's birth. "I think he'd recognize that technologies themselves aren't inherently liberating or oppressive. It's how humanity implements them that matters." He preserved this knowledge not just because it was innovative, but because he believed future generations would use it more wisely than his own. Are we living up to that belief? Jessica's question reflected concerns that had emerged as various interests jockeyed for position around their discovery. "That's what we're about to find out," Thomas replied. "The Liberty Engineers did their part by preserving this knowledge. Our responsibility isn't just revealing it, but helping ensure it fulfills its intended purpose, creating systems that enhance independence rather than dependency, sustainability rather than depletion, distribution rather than concentration." As Thomas prepared for the International Technological Summit that would convene on the ranch the following day, bringing together engineers, environmental scientists, economic theorists, and policy experts to examine the full implications of the Liberty Engineer's vision, he felt a profound connection to his great-great-grandfather. Across the span of 150 years, they shared not just bloodline, but purpose, using technology to expand human possibility rather than constrain it. The silo stood as it had for generations, its weathered exterior giving no indication of the revolutionary contents it had protected through decades of historical transformation. But its purpose had been fulfilled not merely through preservation, but through revelation, at precisely the moment when humanity most needed alternative pathways forward. Jeremiah's final journal entry, written the day the hidden chamber was sealed in 1873, seemed to speak directly to this moment. "I place this creation in time's safekeeping, trusting that when necessity and opportunity align, those who share my blood will also share my vision. The greatest technology is that which liberates rather than subjugates, which distributes power rather than concentrates it, which sustains rather than depletes. May those who rediscover this work recognize not merely its mechanical principles, but its moral purpose." As dawn broke over the Montana landscape, illuminating the silo with golden light that seemed to transform its weathered sandstone into something transcendent, Thomas welcomed the first arriving delegates to what would become known as the Liberty Engineers Summit, the beginning of a technological renaissance founded on principles of independence, sustainability, and distributed prosperity that had waited 150 years for their moment of emergence. 1 month after the discovery of the perpetual engine, the transformation of both the Caldwell Ranch and the surrounding world had exceeded even Thomas's most optimistic expectations. The Liberty Engineers Summit had concluded its initial phase, producing a comprehensive framework for implementing the rediscovered technology across multiple sectors, while preserving its core principles of independence, sustainability, and distributed prosperity. The ranch itself had become something entirely new, an international research center where engineers, scientists, historians, and policy experts collaborated to understand and develop applications based on Jeremiah's preserved knowledge. The weathered buildings that had once housed generations of struggling farmers now buzzed with innovative energy as teams worked to translate 19th century genius into 21st century solutions. Most remarkably, the principles behind the perpetual engine had proven immediately applicable using contemporary materials and manufacturing techniques. The first modern prototype, dubbed Liberty One, had been constructed in just 18 days by a collaborative team of engineers from 12 countries, demonstrating that Jeremiah's core innovations could be replicated and scaled using accessible technology. The elegance of the design is extraordinary, Dr. Eliza Washington, Director of Advanced Energy Systems at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, explained during a crowded press conference. What the Liberty engineers developed wasn't just ahead of its time, it represents an entirely different approach to energy generation that modern science had simply never explored. We've been optimizing systems based on fundamentally limited principles, while these Civil War-era innovators developed an approach with vastly greater potential. The market implications had been seismic. Energy corporation stocks plummeted as investors recognized the existential threat to traditional power generation models. Oil futures collapsed as analysis suggested that widespread implementation of Liberty engine principles could reduce fossil fuel demand by over 70% within a decade. Venture capital flooded towards startups focused on developing commercial applications of the technology. Yet unlike previous technological disruptions, the Liberty engine's emergence was being carefully managed to minimize economic displacement. The implementation framework developed at the summit included provisions for transitioning existing energy infrastructure workers, repurposing production facilities, and ensuring that benefits flowed to communities rather than concentrating in corporate entities. "We have an unprecedented opportunity," Thomas had told the assembled delegates during the summit's opening session. Not just to implement revolutionary technology, but to implement it in a revolutionary way, emphasizing distributed benefit rather than centralized control. This was Jeremiah's vision, not merely mechanical innovation, but social transformation through technological liberation. This perspective had resonated powerfully, particularly as examination of the complete Liberty engineers' documentation revealed that Jeremiah and his colleagues had anticipated many of the challenges facing contemporary society. Their journals contained prescient warnings about environmental degradation resulting from extractive energy systems, concentration of power through monopolistic control of essential resources, and the erosion of democratic principles through economic dependency. Thomas found himself standing before the United Nations General Assembly, an unlikely speaker who nonetheless commanded the rapt attention of global leaders. The technology preserved beneath that Montana silo doesn't merely offer a new way to generate energy, he explained, his voice steady despite the momentous occasion. It represents an opportunity to reimagine our relationship with technology itself, to develop systems that enhance human freedom rather than constraining it, that regenerate natural systems rather than depleting them, that distribute prosperity rather than concentrating it. The Caldwell family had become unlikely celebrities, not merely for discovering the perpetual engine, but for their approach to its re-emergence. Rather than seeking to patent or control the technology, they had established the Liberty Engineers Foundation, a non-profit entity dedicated to ensuring the innovations remained in the public domain while being implemented according to their original intended principles. Jessica had emerged as the technical voice of the family, her agricultural engineering background providing the perfect foundation for explaining the technology's principles to various audiences. What's most revolutionary about the perpetual engine isn't just its efficiency or sustainability, she explained, during a global broadcast that reached over 2 billion viewers. It's the scale flexibility. The same principles work at household level or community level. This fundamentally changes the relationship between energy producers and consumers, potentially eliminating the distinction entirely. Michael had discovered unexpected application for his business education, helping develop economic models that demonstrated how distributed energy independence could revitalize rural communities worldwide. When production costs approach zero and resource inputs become minimal, he testified before the Senate Commerce Committee, we need entirely new economic frameworks. The Liberty Engineers weren't just creating technology, they were anticipating an economy of abundance rather than scarcity. Eleanor had become the historical voice of the discovery, contextualizing the Liberty Engineers' work within the complex social transitions of post-Civil War America. They recognized that political freedom ultimately depends on economic independence, she explained to journalists documenting the phenomenon. Their technological innovations were fundamentally instruments of democratic empowerment, designed to prevent the concentration of power they saw emerging through industrial monopolization. The practical implications for the Caldwell Ranch had been transformative. The land that had struggled to support a single family through conventional agriculture now generated abundant, clean energy while hosting research facilities that employed dozens of local residents. The financial pressures that had nearly forced its sale had evaporated as opportunities expanded exponentially. Most significantly, other families across the country had experienced similar transformations as additional Liberty Engineers repositories were located and activated. The Colorado site, hidden beneath an abandoned mining operation, contained advanced water purification and distribution systems that could convert contaminated sources into potable supply without chemical treatment. The Pennsylvania repository housed revolutionary soil regeneration technology that could restore depleted agricultural land within a single growing season. The California site contained communication systems that operated without centralized infrastructure, allowing direct connection even in remote regions. Together, these rediscovered innovations offered solutions to many of humanity's most pressing challenges: clean energy, water security, food production, and communication access, all developed through principles emphasizing independence, sustainability, and distributed benefit. 6 weeks after the initial discovery, Thomas stood alone in the hidden chamber beneath the silo, communing silently with his great-great-grandfather's creation. The perpetual engine continued its quiet operation, unaffected by the transformation it had triggered in the world above. Its brass components gleamed in the gentle illumination of its own power generation, a testament to engineering principles that had waited 150 years for recognition. "You were right to wait," Thomas whispered, running his hand along the precisely machined surface. "The world wasn't ready then. I hope we're ready now." A soft footstep behind him announced Eleanor's arrival. She placed her hand on his shoulder, understanding his need for this moment of connection across generations. "The last journal entry," she said. "I've been thinking about it constantly." Thomas nodded, recalling Jeremiah's final written words before sealing the chamber. "I entrust this creation not to institutions or authorities, but to those who share my blood, and, I hope, my values. Technology should liberate human potential, not constrain it. May those who rediscover this work recognize that purpose above all else." "He would be proud," Eleanor said simply, "not just of the discovery, but of how you've managed its emergence." The global implementation of Liberty Engineers' technology was proceeding with remarkable speed, yet with careful attention to the social principles that had informed its original development. The open-source collaborative approach had prevented any single entity from establishing proprietary control, while implementation protocols ensured benefits flowed primarily to communities rather than corporations or governments. Most remarkable was the effect on regions that had been systematically marginalized by conventional energy systems. Rural communities and developing nations found themselves at the forefront of implementation as Liberty Engine technology eliminated the massive infrastructure requirements that had previously limited their development options. Areas without established power grids could leapfrog directly to distributed, self-sustaining systems based on principles that required minimal external inputs. Thomas and Eleanor made their way from the hidden chamber to the ranch house now, serving as the administrative center for the Liberty Engineers Foundation. The property hummed with purposeful activity as researchers, engineers, and policy experts collaborated to develop implementation frameworks tailored to diverse global contexts. Jessica met them at the door, tablet in hand, displaying real-time data from the first community-scale implementation in a neighboring county. "The entire system is operational," she reported, her expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and deeper emotion. 300 households, the medical center, schools, and agricultural operations, all running on a scaled version of the perpetual engine. Total external energy inputs reduced by 94%. Michael joined them, returning from meetings with agricultural cooperatives forming around the region. "It's not just about energy," he explained, displaying maps showing reorganized production systems. "When power generation approaches zero cost, the entire economic model of rural communities transforms. We're seeing integrated food production systems that simply weren't viable under fossil fuel economics." The broader implications were beginning to manifest globally. Nations that had been dependent on oil and gas exports faced difficult transitions. but found new opportunities in manufacturing components for Liberty engine implementations. Regions struggling with pollution from conventional power generation discovered pathways to rapid environmental recovery. Communities historically exploited for resource extraction began reclaiming both land and political agency as dependency relationships weakened. Most significantly, the predicted corporate and governmental resistance had largely failed to materialize, not through lack of attempt, but through fundamental inability to contain a technology designed specifically for distributed implementation. Unlike previous innovations that required massive capital investment and centralized infrastructure, Liberty engine principles could be applied at virtually any scale using increasingly accessible materials and manufacturing techniques. "They can't put the genie back in the bottle," Dr. Chen had explained during a strategy session with potential opposition forming. The Liberty engineers designed this technology specifically to resist centralized control. The more entities try to restrict it, the more distributed its implementation becomes. This reality had forced even the most resistant interests to adapt their approaches. Energy corporations began rapidly transitioning toward facilitating implementation rather than fighting it, recognizing that their survival depended on finding roles within the new paradigm. Governments shifted from attempting to regulate deployment toward developing frameworks for managing the social transitions it triggered. 3 months after the discovery, Thomas found himself addressing the Global Rural Development Conference, an audience comprised primarily of farmers and community leaders from traditionally underserved regions worldwide. "For generations," he told them, "we've been told that rural communities are inevitably declining, that centralization is the inescapable future, that we must accept our diminishing relevance in an urbanized world." The Liberty engineers rejected that narrative a century and a half ago, and their vision offers us an opportunity to reject it again today. He gestured toward a display showing real-time data from Liberty engine implementations across diverse global contexts: Arctic villages in Alaska, remote mountain communities in the Himalayas, island nations in the Pacific, agricultural cooperatives in Africa. Each showed the same pattern of rapidly increasing energy independence, declining production costs, and expanding local economic opportunities. "Technology doesn't have predetermined social outcomes," Thomas continued. "The same innovation can concentrate power or distribute it, increase dependency or enhance independence, extract value from communities or generate it within them. The difference lies not in the technology itself, but in the principles guiding its implementation." The Liberty engineers understood this fundamental truth and preserved their knowledge until humanity could implement it with wisdom rather than merely exploit it for profit. The transformation of the Caldwell Ranch continued as summer approached. The property that had struggled to support a single family through conventional agriculture now hosted an international research center, practical demonstration facilities for Liberty engine applications, and training programs for implementation. Specialists from around the world, most remarkably, the surrounding region, had begun experiencing an unprecedented renaissance. Neighboring properties that had been absorbed into corporate agricultural operations were transitioning back toward diverse family farming as energy costs approached zero and new production models became viable. Young people who had left the region for urban opportunities were returning, drawn by expanding possibilities in everything from sustainable agriculture to advanced manufacturing based on Liberty Engineers' principles. It's not just a technological revolution, Eleanor noted, observing this revival from their porch one evening. It's the social transformation Jeremiah and his colleagues believed would follow from true energy independence. The silo itself had been carefully preserved in its original form, though now serving as both historical monument and functioning power source for the entire property. Its weathered sandstone exterior gave no indication of the revolutionary technology it contained, yet its significance had been recognized through designation as both a National Historic Landmark and UNESCO World Heritage Site. 1 year after the discovery, the family gathered in the hidden chamber to commemorate the anniversary. Thomas had insisted on maintaining the space in its original condition, a decision that preserved both historical authenticity and spiritual connection to Jeremiah's vision. The perpetual engine continued its quiet operation, now understood, not merely as an innovative machine, but as the physical embodiment of a profound social philosophy. "I've been thinking about time capsules," Jessica said, running her hand along the brass components that had maintained their function across 150 years of continuous operation. Most preserve artifacts or messages, passive objects waiting to be discovered. But Jeremiah created something different, an active preservation that continued functioning while waiting for its moment of recognition. "That's what makes the Liberty Engineers so extraordinary," Michael added. "They didn't just anticipate future needs. They actively prepared solutions and ensured they would survive until humanity was ready to implement them properly." Thomas considered how profoundly his understanding of his inheritance had transformed. The land that had seemed merely a struggling agricultural operation now revealed itself as something far more significant, a deliberate preservation of revolutionary knowledge entrusted to generations of Caldwells who maintained the property without fully understanding its true purpose. Jeremiah wrote about stewardship, Thomas said, retrieving the journal that had initiated their discovery. He believed that each generation holds resources and knowledge not solely for their own benefit, but in trust for those who will follow. The Liberty Engineers preserved their innovations not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well, developing technology that their own time wasn't prepared to implement responsibly. Eleanor, whose historical perspective had proven invaluable throughout the emergence process, nodded in agreement. They recognized something profound about technological development, that technical capability often advances more rapidly than social wisdom. They chose to align the emergence of their innovations with humanity's readiness to implement them according to their intended principles. The global impact of the Liberty Engineers' rediscovered knowledge continued to expand, defying conventional patterns of technological diffusion. Rather than filtering slowly from privileged regions to marginalized ones, Liberty Engine implementation spread most rapidly in areas previously underserved by conventional energy systems, precisely as Jeremiah and his colleagues had intended. Rural communities worldwide discovered newfound leverage in economic relationships as energy dependency diminished. Regions historically exploited for resource extraction began reclaiming both environmental quality and political agency. The predicted economic disruption had occurred, but in patterns that distributed benefits far more equitably than previous technological revolutions. Most significantly, the principles underlying the perpetual engine had catalyzed innovation across multiple sectors. Engineers worldwide, inspired by the Liberty Engineers approach, began developing new technologies based on similar philosophies, emphasizing distributed implementation, minimal resource requirements, and enhancement of community independence, rather than dependency on external systems. This is the true Renaissance, Dr. Chen explained during a symposium examining the broader implications. Not just implementing what the Liberty Engineers preserved, but rediscovering an entire approach to technological development that prioritizes human liberation rather than control, regeneration rather than depletion, and distribution rather than concentration. The Caldwell Ranch, once fighting for survival against seemingly inevitable decline, had become a global center for this emerging paradigm. The land that 5 generations had stewarded through increasingly difficult circumstances now served as both practical demonstration and philosophical foundation for a fundamentally different relationship between humanity, technology, and the natural world. 2 years after the discovery, Thomas stood on a hillside overlooking the property at sunset. The evening light transformed the weathered sandstone of the silo into a warm golden beacon visible for miles across the Montana landscape. Below, researchers and visitors from around the world moved purposefully between buildings that harmoniously blended the ranch's historical architecture with elegant modern additions designed according to Liberty Engineers' principles. Eleanor joined him, slipping her hand into his as they silently appreciated the view. After a moment, she spoke the question that had been gradually forming since their discovery. Do you think there are other repositories we haven't found yet? Other innovations the Liberty Engineers preserved for future generations? Thomas considered this possibility, recalling passages from Jeremiah's journals that hinted at additional collaborations beyond the 7 confirmed sites. I believe their vision was more comprehensive than what we've discovered so far. The perpetual engine and its companion technologies address fundamental needs: energy, water, food, communication. But the Liberty Engineers were thinking beyond basic necessities toward true human flourishing. What might that include? Eleanor wondered. Systems that enhance human capability rather than replacing it, Thomas suggested. Technologies that strengthen community bonds rather than isolating individuals. Innovations that expand consciousness rather than constraining it. He smiled slightly. Jeremiah wrote about mechanical systems that liberate rather than subjugate. And I suspect we've only begun to understand what he meant. As darkness fell over the Montana landscape, lights powered by the perpetual engine illuminated the ranch buildings, creating a warm glow that seemed to embody the Liberty Engineers' enduring vision. Technology serving human needs without consuming irreplaceable resources or creating systemic dependency. The silo stood as it had for 150 years, its external appearance largely unchanged, despite the revolutionary transformation it had triggered. This continuity seemed appropriate, a reminder that true progress builds upon foundations established by previous generations, while opening new possibilities for those yet to come. Thomas thought once more of Jeremiah's final journal entry, words that had guided the family's approach throughout the emergence process. I place this creation in time safekeeping, trusting that when necessity and opportunity align, those who share my blood will also share my vision. The greatest technology is that which liberates rather than subjugates, which distributes power rather than concentrates it, which sustains rather than depletes. May those who rediscover this work recognize not merely its mechanical principles, but its moral purpose. Looking across the transformed landscape of the ranch toward the global changes flowing from their discovery, Thomas felt profound gratitude for his ancestors' foresight and trust. The Liberty engineers had preserved their knowledge through generations, patiently waiting for the moment when humanity's need aligned with its readiness to implement their vision responsibly. That moment had arrived, not through any single person's actions, but through the convergence of necessity, opportunity, and the courage to pursue a different path when conventional wisdom insisted none existed. The ancient silo, standing sentinel against the night sky, represented not merely historical preservation, but active participation across time, generations separated by decades unified in common purpose. As Thomas and Eleanor made their way back toward the warmly lit ranch house, where Jessica and Michael were hosting engineers from 5 continents, developing next-generation implementations of Liberty engine principles, they felt the weight of stewardship transforming into the joy of fulfillment. What had begun as the desperate struggle of a family farm against seemingly inevitable decline had become something far greater: the emergence of a technological renaissance founded on principles of independence, sustainability, and distributed prosperity. The 150-year journey of the perpetual engine, from creation to rediscovery, had reached its intended destination not in a museum of historical curiosities, but in active implementation worldwide. Jeremiah's vision, preserved through generations of Caldwells who maintained his creation without fully understanding its purpose, had finally emerged at precisely the moment when humanity most needed alternatives to systems that had proven unsustainable. The silo that had dominated the Caldwell Ranch for generations stood as testament not merely to innovative engineering, but to the profound understanding that true technological progress measures its value not in power concentrated, but in potential liberated, a principle as relevant in the 21st century as it had been when Jeremiah sealed his creation beneath Montana soil in 1873, trusting future generations to complete what he had begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.